Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I am thrilled to welcome someone who's been a journalist, writing for such publications as the Toronto Star, National Post, and the Plains Magazine, the board member of Artists Against Antisemitism. She's the author of 5 Jewish novels, including the recent Canadian bestseller, The Night Sparrow. Please help me welcome Shelly Sanders. Shelly, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have a lot to cover, but I want to start by going back with you. You're born in Ontario. First, I want to know a little bit about your family life was like, and also, I'm not sure I was reading this correctly in your bio, but you didn't know that you were Jewish?
No. So it was a huge secret in my family. And so I was born in Toronto, but we moved to Chicago when I was very young. And so I was raised in Chicago. But all of my family was, most of them were in Montreal. And so we would go back and visit twice a year. And so I had no idea. I grew up with no religion, and really felt quite ignorant by the time I got to high school because I just knew nothing. Like in Shakespeare, you know, how they have references and that. I had no idea.
You didn't think that you were, I mean, did you celebrate anything at all?
We celebrated Christmas and Easter, but completely secular. And I was very curious. Like, I would ask my parents. So we grew up in a very Catholic neighborhood, Rolling Meadows, Illinois. And I would ask my parents, you know, like, what is Christmas? Like, what does it mean? And like, what is Easter? Like, what are we celebrating? And they would just sort of shoo me away, don't ask questions. And that was basically it. So I would find out from my friends, you know, that in the neighborhood, what it was, but it was entirely secular. I was always searching, though, looking for a spiritual kind of foundation. And my mother told me only in like the last 10 years, I guess, that when we lived in Toronto, when I was, you know, young, up until the time I was 7, I would go next door. Our neighbors were conservative, kind of Orthodox Jews, the Goldbergs. And I would invite myself over for their Shabbat dinners and high holidays, apparently. And I really enjoyed, my mom said, yeah, you really enjoyed going over for all of those things. And this was before I was aware, like it was just in me. And I was always drawn to, Jewish authors and like Chagall, like Jewish painters and Rothko, and you know, always was searching. I would go to my friends' churches, you know, always looking, always searching, trying to, you know, because I couldn't put it into words as a child, but I wanted more. I wanted to know why we were celebrating these things. I wanted to understand what we were celebrating. But when I would go to churches, I was very like, the Jesus on the cross was very upsetting, and I didn't like that. There were certain things I just wasn't comfortable with. And so, you know, I knew that wasn't really me, but I didn't know anything else. And I, you know, really didn't have that understanding. And so, so I basically grew up with no religion and no sort of foundation. Plus we moved around every 2 years. So I didn't have like, that sense of a home in the sense of like, security that way either.
Right.
And the third issue was I had undiagnosed ADHD. So I was, constantly getting criticism and discipline in all of my schools as well. So that was really a challenge. It was a challenge to say the least.
Well, how did you first find out?
So I found out when I was 18. We were back living in Ontario, and I had one Jewish friend at my high school, Lizzie Strauss, and her parents weren't allowing her to go to prom because she had to go with a Jewish guy, and there were no Jewish guys in the school. So I came home really upset and was really mad at her parents. And my mom, I think, had just had enough. And she said, you know, you're Jewish. And I said, what? And that's how she told me. And she told me, yes, you know, that you know, my grandmother was Jewish and from Russia, and she had died when I was 13. So at this point, and she's the only grandparent I knew. And even still, she actually lived in Barbados when I was growing up because she and my grandfather ran a resort there. So I really didn't see a lot of her, maybe like twice a year. So, but I always knew she was different from other grandmothers. Her accent, she was very guarded. She was not the least bit maternal at all. Like, it just very different grandmother, and a sadness to her. So, yeah. So anyway, that's how I found out when I was 18. And then, so I called my friend and she said, well, you would have been in the camp like Anne Frank. And, you know, what little I knew about Judaism was kind of like the horrifying bits where I'd read The Diary of Anne Frank,
Right.
and I'd also seen that Holocaust miniseries with Meryl Streep that came out. And I watched that alone in Rolling Meadows, Illinois, and by myself. And I was just horrified by that. And so I really was kind of that was kind of upsetting. And when I talked to some friends and told them about this that were non-Jewish, I remember standing in the hallway of my house, and they were looking at me going, well, you sort of do have a Slavic look to you. And I said, yeah, but I'm Jewish, so I think that's different. And they go, well, why would you want to be Jewish? And that was like this negative, like immediate negativity. So anyway, I went off to college and didn't really know what to make of it. And it took me a long time. I didn't know anything about reform. I really, I didn't know anything. I was completely ignorant. We didn't have the internet, of course, back then in the 80s. And so it wasn't until I had my first child that I was like, okay, I really want to know. And my grandmother's sister was still alive in Montreal. So I was able to ask her, and she's actually the inspiration in Daughters of the Occupation of the character Miriam.
Before we get to that, I'm just curious. Yeah, I was reading that too, but before we get to that, I'm just your parents tell you why? I mean, first, why was it kept from you for all those years?
So it was kept from my own mother, my grandmother. So my grandmother's, you'd have to go back to my grandmother's history. So my grandmother's parents, my great-grandparents, my great-grandfather was exiled from Riga, Latvia in 1905 for being part of a workers' revolution. And then in what I understand from talking to experts, researchers in Latvia, he had an arranged marriage with my great-grandmother, Sophie, and then they were exiled to Novosibirsk, Siberia. So a year later, my aunt was born, and 2 years later, my grandmother was born in 1908 in Siberia. We had no idea why they were in Siberia, and nobody knew anything about Latvia. I found that out only about maybe like 7 or 8 years ago about the Latvian roots.
Yeah, we're going to ask about that too. Yeah, we'll get to that.
I know. So it was like, I know there's just a lot. And so we didn't know that, so I didn't know any of that. We didn't know why she was in Russia. But in doing my first novel, I really discovered how horribly difficult it would have been to be a Jewish girl in the last Tsar's Russia, because he was very anti-Semitic. And in one of my talks I gave, a woman came up to me and said, on her deathbed, her mother, who would have been my grandmother's age, told her that she'd been raped by a Cossack at the age of 4 in Russia. And that really kind of jarred me like a lot, because, my mother has said that she grew up, not really feeling loved and not seen. Like my grandmother just didn't have a maternal capacity in her. And I think she was very closed off. I certainly sensed that as a child. And, so I think what happened, she eventually, she was quite a remarkable woman, because they then had to flee a pogrom. The pogroms erupted as, the revolution was coming on. My Aunt Nusha told me how they had to flee, and they caught the train to Vladivostok and then took a steamer over to Shanghai, which took Jews without papers. It was quite a common place for Jews to go. And so my grandmother finished her schooling there and then worked for a year, and then took a ship by herself to California and worked as a live-in nanny and got a business degree from UCal Berkeley. In 1929, she graduated. So very unusual, and in her, in like her 4th or 5th language. So, of course, I knew none of this growing up. And I think what happened was, she went back after university and met my Canadian grandfather. And I think that They settled in Montreal, which was a hotbed of anti-Semitism. I mean, literally, they had a guy named Adrian Arcand, who was a Nazi follower, and they wore the brown coats, and they had the swastika, and they had the Nazi salute, the whole thing. And he was actually put in prison during the war because the Canadian government was afraid of what he would incite. And he was in Montreal, where my grandmother was. So I think my grandmother decided, like a number of people I've discovered, she had 2 daughters, and I think she decided, I don't want to tell them. I don't want them to go through what I've gone through. And also, Montreal was, and still is, a hotbed of anti-Semitism. And, Jews were not allowed, Jewish doctors weren't allowed to practice at the hospital. They're very limited. They were limited in terms of university placements. They were banned from the country club, banned from the curling club, banned. So, not able to own a house. They weren't able to buy property in Montreal. So, I think she just said, I'm not telling them. And she swore my Aunt Nusha and my Uncle Sasha, when they came over after the war, they had been they'd stayed in Shanghai, and then the Japanese occupied, and so they'd had to live through that. My Aunt Nusha told me that she was sworn to secrecy, to not tell any of us what happened. And my mother found out at 24 when her younger sister told an anti-Semitic joke, and the table went flat around it. My Aunt Nusha and Uncle Sasha were there, and my Aunt Gail just was like, "Are we Jewish?" And and that's how they found out. And so my mom was 24 and married by then, and so no idea. And this is really the kicker. So what my great grandmother Sophie Talon came over. She was widowed after the war with my Aunt Nusha and Uncle Sasha. And she was, Jewish and lived in an apartment in Montreal. When she died, my mother and her sister were not allowed to go to the funeral because it was a Jewish funeral, and she was buried in a Jewish cemetery. So I took, so my mom and aunt never attended their grandmother's funeral. So I took my mom and my niece and my son a few years ago to Montreal. And for the first time, my mom saw the headstone in a Jewish cemetery, which also interestingly had a Kabbalah symbol on it as well. So anyway, that's the level of secrecy that it was. And I think my mother had been raised in the secrecy that she felt like she shouldn't tell me, that it was a bad thing, that being Jewish was bad. I think she literally had gotten this message. And so, that's why I think, I wish I could ask my grandmother, but like I said, she died when I was 17 and I had no idea.
But I mean, you kind of answered a little bit of my next question was how did you grow up feeling before you found out? What were your thoughts on Jews? I know you said you had a curiosity about it, but was it something was it ever talked about in the house? Was it?
No. Never. And I watched that Holocaust myself. And I should tell you too that I'm the only one who was a reader. I'm an unusual writer, and that nobody in my family read. And my brother and sister have never read my books. My father never read my books, and they never will. They're not readers. I grew up in a very unusual house, kind of, so I was reading Mordecai Rickler. I was reading Jewish books, very drawn to them, but it was never talked about. And I was the only one that was interested in it. And which always has fascinated me. But it is the reality. But yeah, we did not talk about it, and I had no idea, but I was drawn to Jewish shows and Jewish writers and art, and as I said, so it was just, I think, in me. There was something in me there.
And then you discovered the Latvian side as well afterwards.
Yes, so when I went with my daughter and mother to visit my Aunt Nusha in Montreal, and as I said, she is the inspiration for Miriam in Daughters of the Occupation. So she basically had glaucoma and couldn't see, and she was in her late 80s and in this apartment, and she chain smoked. It's a miracle she lived as long as she did, and she did not die of cancer. The woman chain smoked constantly. So anyway, we go to her apartment, and my mom takes my 6-month-old out, and it was like pulling teeth getting her to talk about her past. I said, I want to know about your life in Russia, and how did you end up in Siberia? She wouldn't tell me that at all, but she did tell me finally a little bit about growing up in Siberia. And I ended up, I was a journalist, so I ended up with 30 pages of notes. So I was pretty happy with that. Then I discovered, in her bedroom, the boxes of photos, including tons of my grandmother as a child. And I said, can I take some of these photos of Nana? No, she said, no. And I was like, what? And, being a journalist, and I don't like being told no and those things. My mom was back and I said, just keep her busy. I said I was going to the bathroom and I stuffed photos that had my grandmother in them down my shirt, including small photo albums. All of them had my grandmother in them. And she had written Shelly, like I'm named after her. She was Rachel, but went by Shelly. And I had them all in my clothing, and it was summer. So I didn't have as much. I wished it had been winter. So I come out from the bedroom and my mother looks at me like, oh my God, we have to go. Nusha can't tell a thing because she's blind. Like what she was going to do with these photos, I don't know. She was just very ornery, very contrary. So anyway, I leave with the photos and, thank God. But I had two more kids and didn't really have time. I was working as a freelancer and we needed the money. So I was pursuing journalism. And then when a few years ago, after my first 3 books came out, I decided to look at the photos and I had to learn a bit of Russian and get people to translate. And I discovered that a lot of them were taken in this place called Dvinsk. And I looked it up and I couldn't find it on the map. And I'm like, Dvinsk, my grandmother was in these photos. One was from 1911 and I'm like, and she was a little girl. Anyway, so I discovered that's Yiddish for Daugavpils, Latvia. And I'm like, Daugavpils, Latvia. And my mom and my aunt had never heard of their mother coming from Latvia, like not at all. So I did a really deep dive using a Jewish ancestry website, Jewish genealogy, Jewish Gen, and which is free, fabulous resource, and put in names, and I found the marriage certificate of my great grandparents in 1905, Riga, and I'm like, they got married in Riga. But then why was my grandmother in Siberia? There were so many questions, and I had these photos taken of them all in Riga and Daugavpils and all of this in Latvia, and I just could not put the dots together. So I ended up going by myself to Latvia for a week, and I set up meetings. I sent information to the Jewish director of the museum and also to the archivist, the Latvian archives. And I met, first of all, with the guy at Ilya Lenski at the Jewish Museum in Riga. And he had the information on my family, and he said, so your great-grandfather Mendel Talon was involved in the revolution and exiled to Siberia in 1905. And I'm like, what? I had no idea. Like, our family had no idea. I was kind of proud. I thought, oh, that's cool. My great-grandfather was a rebel working for workers' rights. And he also told me that he was quite well off and that he had a second-class merchant, was a member of the Merchant Guild second class, which was very rare for a Jew. I had the address from Jewish Gen where he lived, and the house is still standing, and I was able to go to his house as well as his younger brother's house. And I found out all of this information, and I'm like, this is unbelievable. Like he was just a wealth of information about my family, and he figured they'd been timber merchants, and it was just phenomenal. Like it was huge. So then I go to the archivist, and again, I had sent information, and I go in the archive building, which on the outside is this kind of beautiful old building. I should say that Latvia is UNESCO designated for their Art Nouveau. They have a phenomenal collection of architecture that way. So on the outside, this building is gorgeous. Inside, it's Soviet. It's a very Soviet building because they were only free in 1991. So you go in and it's like entering the Soviet Union, and it was really something. And anyway, she had on the table, we had an appointment, a pile of books and photos. And she said, these are 26 of your relatives, and they were all murdered in the Holocaust. And I went, what? We had no idea, no idea.
Before you go, what's your feeling that you're growing up that you don't even know that you're Jewish?
No.
Now you can find out that you're not only Jewish, but you had family murdered in the Holocaust.
Yes.
I mean, it's got to be mind-boggling. I mean, what was your feeling?
I wished I had someone with me because I was very upset, I have to say. It really upended everything I thought I knew about myself. I have to say, it really did. I had no idea that the Holocaust narrative was part of my family story. And I it made me understand as well why my grandmother hid what she hid, because it turned out her entire extended family had been murdered, including cousins she was so close to. I have photos of her with cousins from the time she was like 4 until she was like in her 20s, when she'd go back and visit. And she even came back after she graduated at Berkeley and with these same cousins. And so she was very close to them. And I honestly was almost sick to my stomach. Like I was shocked, and I couldn't take the documents out. So I took pictures of them, and they were all in Russian. And it was, there were a lot of faces that I recognized from photos, and some had no photos, and still I don't have photos of them. So that's frustrating. And there was one guy who looked really familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on it, but he just had this familiarity, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I found out when I went home. But the next day I had a guide, because it was recommended. As soon as I left the archives, I booked a guide to take me to the Rumbula forest. And I had researched this before coming and knew how horrific it was. On November 30th and December 8th, 1941, 26,000 Jews were killed, Latvian Jews. They were in a ghetto. The ghetto was very short-lived. They were marched in the horrible weather with no coats, nothing on, and anyone that couldn't keep up was shot. And they were marched to the forest, and then they had, it was called sardine packing, and they had them get undressed, and they basically shot them, and they would fall, they would, be in the pit, and there were just layers of people. And like when I knew this coming, but didn't realize that some of my family was there. And again, when we went to the forest and I saw the mounds that have like a cement border around them, and there are many mounds, like you can imagine, I was like almost like ill. Like I didn't feel well for days after that. And, seeing that. And, they have all of these rocks, but no names on them, because they don't know who's in which grave. They don't know who was killed when. They just know there are 26,000 Latvian Jews there. And I'm standing there like, it was just atrocious. And I'm like, number one, how did I not know this? And how come I've read a lot on the Holocaust since I discovered I was Jewish, but never heard of Latvia and the Rumbula massacre. And it's the size and scale of Babi Yar in Kiev. So I was very, intrigued and upset by this. And I knew at that moment I wanted to write something. Like I knew as a writer that I would need to put it into words. I wasn't sure what that was going to take, what form at that point, but I was really upset. And that night in my hotel room, I just, wrote how I felt and notes and things like that, not really knowing where it was going to go. And I ended up doing 2 more trips to Riga, and I went to Daugavpils as well, doing research for myself and also the book.
Was there any semblance of a Jewish community left at all, or no?
No, not much. There was some, but they had the largest percentage of collaborators in Latvia, and they had the Einsatzgruppen, and what really was kind of, it was like death by bullets, right? And so this was before the gas chambers. And what is kind of unique to Riga and also Babi Yar was the Nazis decided, this isn't awful. We don't really like watching them die this way. We need to find a way, to kill them without seeing. So the gas chambers came about because of this. So it was so horrific. And a lot of them got drunk and all of that in order to do it. And there were a lot of collaborators. And but yeah, I was stunned. And even still to this day, I still sometimes feel like it's someone else's life sometimes when I think about
how were the people there nowadays when you try to ask? Were they helpful? Were they evasive? Because I've heard things from both, and a lot of times you don't want to talk about it, they don't acknowledge history.
Well, it's true. I got a lot of, I would ask tour guides, and they're like, people don't want to talk about what happened to the Jews. That was the most common response I got. And interestingly, I was there a couple summers ago, And the Canadian ambassador to Latvia took me to breakfast. And the first thing he said to me was, people here don't want to talk about what happened to the Jews. And I'm like, oh my God, and it's true. But that makes me more, I'm tenacious. And then as a journalist, I'm like, I don't care. This story's got to be told. And I didn't care. Like, I just worked around it. And luckily, Ilya Lenski is hugely helpful. And he pointed me towards books. I was able to read a lot of survivors. Like, I think I have about 10 of them anyway, wrote kind of a diary or a journal of what happened. So they were like self-published. I also met with, in New York, he's a survivor of Latvia, which is, I'm not sure how far it is, but it's another part where they had mass murders. And he was a boy when he watched his father and brother killed. And he survived. His mother was taken away, and he was a boy, and he somehow survived. And I've met with him and talked to him and as well. And he's a professor, retired professor, George Schwab in New York. And so I was able to talk to people and read these stories of their experiences. And one, Frida Mickelson, really stood out to me. She was a fashion, she owned a fashion studio kind of thing, in the sense she made things after Vogue. Like, they were Riga was a very much, they called it the Paris of the Baltics. And she was, had really in fashion clothing, and she was quite known for this. And so she was taken to the pits and tried to show her papers saying, look, I can be helpful. I'm a seamstress. I can sew. And they just threw her papers and knocked her out, actually. And she survived because they knocked her out unconscious, and people had to take their shoes off. And it just so happened people's shoes ended up on top of her, covering her. And she didn't wake up until later, and she just stayed there quiet until all the Germans had finished killing and were gone. And that's how and then she survived outside in the forest for 2.5 years. So she was kind of the inspiration for my character's survival in Daughters of the Occupation, because one of the things about all of my books, from my very first book, is the history is very accurate, and I don't make up things. Obviously I fictionalize dialogue and things like that, but all of the events and things are real. And I wanted my character to, if she was going to survive, it had to be a real way that someone did survive. And that's how she survived. And she, survived by not looking too Jewish. She survived by being a seamstress. She survived because people in the Seventh-day Adventist church hit her. Like, she lived in haystacks and dirt poles. Like, and then she did testify at Nuremberg. She ended up testifying. But anyway, so, this is how I got a really good sense of it. And it was cathartic to me to write this. And, I wanted a bigger publisher. I really wanted to make that leap to HarperCollins, to something like that. So of course, got rejections until I found an agent, and then it was quickly bought. But I kept thinking of what my family had gone through and thought, yeah, I'm not stopping till I get this story told.
That's what led to Rachel's Secret, right?
No, that was Daughters of the Occupation. So Rachel's Secret, Rachel's Promise, Rachel's Hope were my first three. It was a smaller publisher, but it was a great, opportunity to work with them. And they were inspired by my grandmother's trajectory from pogrom to Shanghai to the United States. But I did a different pogrom. I did one that was historically significant, whereas my grandmother's had been one of many. They had a lot in Siberia. And so I used one. It was the Kishinev pogrom in 1903, which was the first one of the 20th century. And it was as a journalist, it really spoke to me, because the journalist, the owner and publisher of the daily newspaper in Kishinev, he wrote fake news, inflammatory news about Jews. When a boy was killed, a Christian boy was killed, he blamed Jews for killing him for their blood, for the guy's blood to make matzah. And people, of course, so as a journalist, I thought this was horrible. This was way before Trump, but this was horrible that a publisher abuses his power and privilege to do this. And he incited over Easter weekend a massive pogrom that decimated the Jewish community. And so that was inspired by my grandmother, and then her trajectory of going to Shanghai and that. So those first three books. But, they weren't as well written. I didn't have as good of editors as I have at Harper. And I knew I wanted for Daughters of the Occupation to make that leap. But yeah, that's how that came out. Yeah.
And you won, it's amazing also, that you won then award. Jewish groups honored your books.
I know. It's bizarre to me. It is something I grapple with because I know that my Daughters of the Occupation, it received a starred review in Kirkus, like a Kirkus starred review. And I know I had one of the best editors in Canada who's since retired. Like, he's a legend. And he really helped me, elevated my writing. He was unbelievable. Like, it was such a gift to work with him. And I know it's so well written. And I think in Canada, unfortunately, I've come to see that the smaller publishers are the ones that win the awards, and they don't really give accolades to books published by the bigger publishers here. In the US, I just not big enough. I don't know. I've gotten, great reviews from the Jewish Book Council and all of this kind of thing, but it's just, I don't know, mind-boggling. The industry is just a mystery to me. After 5 books, it's still a mystery.
Same here. So going back a little, you said you find out your family history in Daughters of the Occupation, and you wrote about intergenerational trauma. That's a term that I've seen used a lot in regard to the Holocaust and descendants of survivors. So for those who aren't aware, can you just explain that a little?
Yes. And when I discovered it has become a lot more known in the last couple of years, but this was like 2020 when I discovered the term. And I literally veered from the book because I went down that rabbit hole. It was life changing in the sense it explained a lot. So intergenerational trauma is where they have done research on Holocaust survivors, and then one generation after, 2 generations after. And so Rachel Yehuda at Yale has been hugely involved in this. This is not like some kind of weird science. It's not a junk science. It's a very real thing. They have discovered a lot about how, some people, for some reason, are afraid of fire. And then they discover their grandfather watched his whole family, burned. And they have this horrible, visceral fear of fire. They have seen things like that. And they're inexplicable because they now are seeing through clinics and things they've been doing that it is the trauma the trauma that your gene is, the way your gene expresses can be influenced by trauma of your ancestors. And what I found particularly interesting as the daughter, the firstborn daughter. So when a woman is pregnant with a daughter, when she's 5 months pregnant, the eggs for her granddaughter are present in her daughter. Any trauma that the pregnant woman goes through is passed not only to her daughter, but also to her granddaughter. And so my mother was born in 1938. And so my grandmother was going through huge trauma in terms of being Jewish and a hidden Jew in Montreal, hidden in plain sight, watching the St. Louis, sent back with Jews most of whom were killed. She'd lost contact with all of her relatives in Latvia and was worried about her sister and mother and nephew in Shanghai. And, the anti-Semitism in Montreal. And so she went through a lot, and then she was very depressed. My mother said that her mother would be in her house coat playing solitaire when she went to school, and she'd be in her house coat playing solitaire when she got home from school. Because my grandmother, had a major depression. I think we now know that if you hide your authentic self, that it's very toxic. Danny Shapiro has a great podcast on family called Family Secrets, and she deals with this. I've listened to all of her episodes, and really, it is comforting to know that that I'm not alone, but also horrible to know the toxicity that secrets cause when you aren't when you aren't living your authentic self, like and especially if you're hiding something that people deem as negative. So, this really was, I think, passed on to my mother, who is very closed about who she is. So, for example, when my brother was getting married, he actually married a Jewish girl, and she said that they couldn't get married in a synagogue because my brother wasn't Jewish. Well, he was Jewish by blood. He would have been recognized. And my mother, who knew this, did not say anything. I wasn't living at home. I had no idea this was going on at the time. I found out after, or I would have said something. Anyway, I said to her when my sister-in-law told me this, I said, Mom, why didn't you say something? Didn't want to get involved. And so, I think, I think she was conditioned, to just, I honestly think she was conditioned to not ask questions and to not speak about this at all. And she'll keep telling me things. I mean, she's 87 now. And sometimes things will come out of her mouth and I'm like, how did you not tell me that 20 years ago? It's just like little drips and drafts that come out. It's really something. And she was just conditioned that way, unfortunately. So
you're living your life that way. Yeah. It's hard to break out of that habit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
exactly.
Let's talk about your new book, The Night Sparrow. So
Yes.
Tell me about that and what prompted you to write it.
So all of my books are about, and again, this is, I think my grandmother and my great-grandmother kind of inspire all of my writing because, they were, in my mind, they went through a hell of a lot. My great-grandmother, what she went through getting married and exiled to Siberia, and they're kind of like unsung women who, are not talked about. They're erased from history, forgotten by history, that kind of thing. And so I always am looking for strong female protagonists and a story that's not been told. And that was certainly in Daughters of the Occupation. And, the Kishinev pogrom as well was recognized by critics because it had not been written about other than academic. So I was looking, and my editor at HarperCollins wanted me to write another World War II, but I said, well, it has to be a story not told. And I realized that, Kate Quinn had done The Diamond Eye about one of the more famous snipers, but her story is completely different. There's absolutely no Jewish. She's not Jewish, for one thing. And, it really focuses a lot on the sniper's relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt in the States. So it was completely different than what I was writing. So I really am pleased. I've written the first female Jewish snipers in history anywhere. And they were there, and they're remarkable women. And so I researched, I really am drawn to anything Russian because that is my heritage. And again, I should say, I always loved Russian classics. I was reading them as a teenager. I was reading War and Peace and and Anna Karenina I've read 3 or 4 times. I've just been drawn to anything Russian. Chekhov, I've read everything. So I really wanted to do Russian. And, I discovered Russia was the only country that allowed women in combat in World War II. No other country allowed women in combat. So obviously that I'm going to end up there. And I discovered the Central Women's Sniper Training School. That was my first kind of window into the Night Sparrow, because Stalin set up in 1942 an entire sniper training school just for women in Moscow, just outside of Moscow. And this was the first of its kind ever. And they trained, I think 1,200. There were 2,500 snipers in total. Not all of them were trained there. And I discovered this sniper training school, and I'm like, oh my God, this is fascinating. And then I started finding snipers, and I was able to get some diaries that have been translated only in the last few years into English. Oh. So that was amazing. And so I read also Svetlana Alexandrovich's The Unwomanly Face of War, which is actual testimonies from women in combat. It's like an oral history of women talking about it. So I had all of this, and again, I wanted to make her Jewish, as did my editor, who is not Jewish. Mm-hmm. He said she has more to fight for. You get that kind of vengeance. And, my character, starts out in Minsk and definitely does have that vengeance, but discovers a lot about herself. She's an academic, and they traditionally had a little more trouble adjusting to military life and to shooting and all of that, and being a woman. A lot of the women really struggled with the idea that they were supposed to bear life, and here they were taking life. I mean, it was, they were in men's uniforms. They had nothing, they had men's haircuts. They were, they were treated horribly by a lot of the male soldiers, and raped. And I mean, you just can't even imagine. And they lived basically on their bellies, because as snipers, you're low to the ground and you're over the front line in enemy territory, because you are tasked with getting the top brains who are creating these things. So the average lifespan for a sniper on the front line was 2 weeks. Yeah. So only 500 women survived. Yeah.
So it's just not even just fighting the enemy. You have to watch out for your own troops. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it really was. And they were remarkable. I mean, and what I really loved about them, like they were like 18, and the oldest was 48 and a grandmother. I actually blog on my blog. I try, every month or so to write about an actual sniper. And she was the grandmother sniper, and I'm just blown away by her. And then there were some young. And what I really discovered was how different, because I read men's diaries as well from being on the front as snipers, and the women add so much more color to the war, because they are much more, I would say, emotional, we know. And they would add, they were young women in a man's world, but they also were wanted to know what it was like to fall in love. And they also knew that tomorrow could be their last day. And, one girl wrote about Mean Girls, and one day she wrote about Mean Girls. The next day she writes about how there's a rival for the guy she likes, and she had it out with him. And, another day she writes about she's just hungry for the kill and wants to kill as many fascists as she can. I mean, and so you see this dichotomy of who these women were. They were young women who wanted to be young women, but at the same time, through propaganda, and they, thank God, helped get the fascists. They wanted to eliminate fascism. What they didn't understand, they were eliminating one authoritarianism for another, but they didn't understand that.
Something I don't want to say sweet, but just that they're still doing this task, but then at the heart of it, there's still a woman. There's still, and have those human feelings. And so it's something remarkable, really.
Yeah, it is. And, it really occurred to me, and I wrote about this for Lit Hub and also the Jewish Book Council. I did essays for both of those about these women. So they were women. And I realized, we have war in terms of combat only from the men's point of view. And we've heard from nurses, and who are very valuable. I'm not saying they aren't, but in terms of combat from a woman's point of view, that's been erased from the history books. And in fact, John Keenan, in 1994, was a very prominent historian, and he wrote, John Keegan, I should say. He wrote in 1994, I'm paraphrasing, but under no circumstances have women ever fought men, or will they ever fight men. And I was like, my God, he had no idea. I mean, it was so wrong. And part of that was because what happened at the end of the war, the women, Stalin, they had lost, 30 million people, and he wanted to repopulate the Soviet Union. So they were not allowed to talk about what they had done. They had to go back to their primary duty of motherhood. There was a medal given for women who had 10 or more children. And so they, they were in fear, and they were treated horribly at the end of the war. They were called sluts and all of this kind of thing. And they were, the men could walk around with all their medals, and the women write, and talk to Svetlana in her interviews and in their diaries about how they were afraid to be seen in uniform because they'd be spat at, they'd be treated horribly. And a lot of them had PTSD. There was alcoholism, of course. Some of them couldn't have children. It just was like awful. Like they had no help in terms of a mental point of view, at the end of the war, and they were erased from history. And so one of the things that was really astonishing to me was a few months ago, you probably remember when the US government decided to erase from the websites of the Navy and NATO and all of this female and Black histories of prominent females and Blacks that were in the military. And I was so offended by this and thought this is exactly what Stalin did in 1945. And here it is, the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, literally 2025. And the US government is erasing just like Stalin did. Yeah. And erasing their histories. And so that was striking and upsetting to me. And it just makes me, really glad that I write about these women and celebrate them. And I do want to celebrate them, and I want their names to be added to the historical narrative. And I think girls, like in high school, reading about women like this would be really inspired. And it was always men, in all the history books and all the combat and all of this. And at that time, they were on the same side as us. So we have to remember this, right? They were on the same side. They lost more people than any other country, and they took Berlin. They took Berlin. I mean, obviously with the Americans' help with the Lend-Lease program and all of that, but they still, they were there, and they lost a lot of lives. And so, yeah. And they also had a huge they had we're not sure, between 350 to 500,000 Jews were in the Red Army. And, so yeah, it was huge. There were a lot. And those stories have not been told. People are not aware of that as well, which is what I'm trying to do.
Well, staying on this theme, so you're also on the board of the Artists Against Antisemitism.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, can you tell us about the organization itself and how you got involved?
Yeah, well, I'm in Canada, but I also feel like a bit American. I mean, I have a social insurance number and all of that, and my books are published in the States as well. And we've had huge anti-Semitism here in Canada, like massive. And we didn't have an organization like that. I read about them. I saw them on my social media feed, and I'm like, this is awesome. I'd really like to be part of this. And so I applied to be on the board, and they made me the Canadian liaison. And so we, had an auction, for example, and the money raised, I can't remember how much. It was a very substantial amount. I've been involved in 2 auctions now. Programs were created by different Jewish educational groups in the States, and they are available in Canada as well, to go into high schools and also colleges about how to train leaders, so student leaders and teachers and professors, on how to deal with anti-Semitism and in a positive way, without antagonizing and without resorting to our biggest point we like to make is we're not going to argue. We don't want to be confrontational. We're trying to fight anti-Semitism through education. And this, of course, really appeals to me, this idea of education, and working towards that. So that's what we are all about. Yeah.
It's a good group, good organization. How many people on it? And I think it's important, right? Especially now. Have some. So you're in Canada. You mentioned it briefly. And I cannot look at social media without seeing horrific incidents of anti-Semitism in Canada. It's something that you see very noticeable?
Yes. We have the problem here where our government, which is a liberal government, Mark Carney is our prime minister, and he is, I would say, anti-Semitic. I mean, I don't have a problem saying that. Like he is supporting Hamas through saying that Palestine should be a state. And he has not mentioned the hostages hardly at all. And on our provincial level, the mayor of Toronto did not march for Israel. All the other mayors have. She did not march for Israel. We have, and so when you have this kind of apathy from the leaders, and we had a Jewish girls' school in Toronto vandalized 3 times, and nobody from the government spoke out about it. And on a personal level,
windows shut too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. And I was at an Israeli Jewish restaurant in downtown Toronto with my husband having dinner a couple of months ago. And it has been targeted many times, but I love it and I like to go there to support it. And all of a sudden, there was a pro-Palestinian parade going, and of course, they're all masked, and they threw stink bombs at the restaurant. And so, of course, everyone had to, the smell was, I mean, if you haven't smelt one, you really don't know how bad it is. Like, you cannot be out and smelling it. So there were about 8 police officers there because they'd been following the parade and they were doing nothing. And this guy, you could see him, and my husband's a lawyer, is going, that's illegal. Well, like, why aren't they doing anything? So I went out and he said, I said to the policeman, why aren't you doing something? Like, you can see the guy who's throwing the stink bombs. He said, I wanted to, but the higher ups told me, and he indicated to an earpiece, not to do anything. And that triggered me in a way I'd never expected, because when I wrote about the pogrom, the Kishinev pogrom, the police were told not to interfere if there was a pogrom against the Jews, and they did not interfere, and they allowed it to go on. So something in me snapped, and I was just so upset by this.
Terrifying.
I was really upset, and then ended up, there was another guy upset as me as well, and he ended up giving me his badge number and all that. And he said, I agree. Like, this is the third time that we've been here in a month with vandalism and nothing is done. And I said, well, of course, so they're going to keep doing it. Like, if there's no consequences and they're all masked. And I'm like, do you know how intimidating it is? They're all in masks. Like, you can't even see that. All you can just see your eyes. So anyway, so it ended up that he went and talked to the higher ups, and they ended up charging the guy who was like 36 years old, who had been on assault charges, assaulting an officer last year. So not a good guy. I'm not sure what happened in court. He was in court in June, and I'm not sure. I haven't honestly followed up because I've been working towards a deadline. But that was an incident that I really was just horrified by, how the police do absolutely nothing. Like, you're begging them and they're doing nothing. And so it is upsetting to me on so many levels, seeing, like, in McGill, there's a professor at McGill who's literally advocating for money and supplies to be given to Hamas. and McGill is the Ivy League University of Canada. And I'm like,
that's where it's all happening, the Ivy League universities.
Well, and this is something that really is interesting. When I wrote Daughters of the Occupation, one thing that struck out at me is the collaborators. There was the Araj Commando, and Victor Araj was a law student, and a lot of the people in his commando group were educated people. You had a pilot, you had people doing PhDs, you had professors, you had very learned people, very high up intellectuals. And then the Nazi regime knows how to give propaganda to turn these people. And they literally took these very intellectual, smart people who had gotten along with Jews, no problem at all, and turned them into monsters. So the Araj Commando they know that they killed at least 30,000 Jews. And these are all collaborators. These are Latvians. These are not Germans. These are Latvian collaborators. And so what I found really interesting is the Ivy League schools seem to be the ones that are the worst. And in Canada, University of Toronto and McGill, the two Ivy League schools, are the worst. My nephew is at U of Buffalo, and he has no trouble there. And so, but he has a friend at NYU who's had terrible time, who's Jewish.
Yeah, I would agree with you.
Yeah.
Regular colleges are not the places that the Ivy League is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really something. And history repeating itself. Really, like trite, but yes.
Let's come back to you. So what are you working on next?
So I've actually been commissioned to write a novel for HarperCollins, another one, which is really unusual for fiction. And it is about, again, in Russian women, because, again, only women in Russia were the only ones in combat. And it is a group of female pilots, an entire regiment of female pilots that fought, and they have had the worst of planes. They went up in a biplane, open cockpit biplane in Russia on the Eastern Front with a top speed of 94 miles an hour. It had been used for crop dusting and for training people how to fly. So it was made of canvas and plywood. And so luckily they had this amazing Evdokia Bershanskaya, who was a commander and also had taught flying to men for years. So she was very good about strategy. And so she decided what they would do is they would fly at night, and that would be safer. And they would approach the target, go at the highest altitude, then idle the engine, drop down to bombing altitude. The bombs are on the bottom of the wings, the canvas wings. The navigator releases the bombs with a switch. If the switch does not go off, which happened a lot in the winter, it would seize. She would have to climb out on the wing and manually drop the bombs. Then they would go up to the high altitude to get away from the anti-aircraft artillery and fly back. And they do 10 to 12 missions like this a night. And so these, and again, I'm telling it from people's point of view, and one of them is Jewish. And there were, and she actually received a Hero of the Soviet Union, one of the few females Jews to receive Hero of Soviet Union. This woman, Paulina Gelman, who I'm writing about. And so again, just fascinating. And so, but yeah, so that's what I'm working on. As well, I have a writing residency in Latvia for a month, a fully paid.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, in November. I'm really excited about it. So I'm there for the month of November, and I'm going a week early to do research. And this is a nonfiction about the intersection of intergenerational trauma and estrangement. Because in my family, we have had generational estrangement, and including my children, and all the way up to my great-grandmother and my grandmother that I know of. And the trauma, as I've learned more, I've realized the trauma in my family is not normal. It's not a normal trauma, what they went through, like any Holocaust survivor, any sort of person that's been through any kind of violence or try to be erased or living in hostile conditions, like a Siberia, for example, being a woman, like all of these things. The trauma has really taken a toll on the maternal side of my family. And so, yeah, so that is what I'm, and so, for example, I interviewed, Mark Woolen, who wrote It Didn't Start With You. And it's about the trauma. He also is Jewish, and it's about the intergenerational trauma and how, he has gone back and looked at, the generations and how this trauma, he has treated people who have these kind of inexplicable traumas. And so I've interviewed him, and he was fascinating. I'm interviewing Rachel Yehuda. I'm going to be interviewing some other people as well. And, kind of working on this. I don't know where it's going, but it is something I think really important and definitely cathartic for me to work on, to try and figure it out in words, which is what I like to do. And our roots go back to the late 1700s in Latvia. So being there is a good place to be to work on writing it. So I've been researching it for years and interviewing people. And so that will be a month of writing that I will be doing there.
Well, good luck with it. And most importantly, for you, how can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on pretty much everything. So I'm on, you can go to my website if it's shellysanders.com, and it's Shelly. A lot of people want to put that extra E in. And you can, all of my social media is on there, shellysanders.com. I'm on Instagram, Fiction by Shelly Sanders. Facebook is just Shelly Sanders. Twitter is, it's __ Shelly Sanders. I mean, it's just my name. So you can just do a Google search on me and you will find it. You'll get my website and all of that. On my website, I have, like I said, I blog about the women. I have the essays I've written as well. And I also, my Substack, I do have a newsletter. I'm not great at producing a lot. I just find it exhausting. It's exhausting. And
so much you can do at once. Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I've got a lot of speaking engagements. I'm in New York for a week in September, and I'm in Chicago for a week in October. So I'm doing the best I can without any help, but I'm trying to just do the best I can. But on my Substack, I do have different articles and things like that, my upcoming appearances, things like that. So yeah, so that's how people can find me. And I always reply to emails,
And Shelly, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's been a pleasure getting to talk to you. Your story is amazing, just mind-boggling there. I was looking at it last week.
Yeah.
Just fantastic. But again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Jonathan. Thank you.
This has been the Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. Again, a very special thanks to Shelly Sanders. The book is Night Sparrow. And please, like,
Thanks for tuning in to the Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.